The words sliced through the airport noise like a blade finding bone. Take the next flight, you're slowing us down. My son's whisper carried just enough volume for me to catch every syllable, but not enough for the gate agent to hear. David stood 3 feet away, his wife Sarah nodding in silent agreement, both of them studying their boarding passes as if they contained state secrets rather than seat assignments. I shifted my carry-on bag to my other hand, the plastic handle biting into my palm. We'd been standing in line for maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes that apparently constituted an unbearable delay in their carefully orchestrated travel schedule. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in harsh relief, the scuffed linoleum, the rows of blue plastic chairs, and the tired faces of fellow passengers. But nothing felt as stark as the space that had suddenly opened between my son and me, a chasm measured not in feet but in years of accumulated small cruelties I'd somehow learned to accept. Flight 447 to Denver, we're now boarding Group C, the gate agent announced, her voice crackling through the overhead speakers. That was us. Group C. The middle tier, neither first class nor last call. I fumbled for my boarding pass, my fingers suddenly clumsy against the paper. Mom. David's voice carried that particular tone I'd grown to recognize, the one that suggested I was being unreasonable simply by existing in the same space as him. We talked about this. Sarah and I have the aisle and window. You're in the middle seat behind us. I hadn't remembered talking about it, but then again, there were many conversations I apparently hadn't been present for, despite being in the room when they occurred. The line moved forward. David and Sarah presented their passes with the efficiency of frequent travelers, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of shared irritation with anyone who might disrupt their rhythm. I followed, my coat sleeve catching briefly on the metal stanchion. Margaret Chen, I said to the gate agent, offering my boarding pass. She scanned it with a practiced motion, then looked up at me with the kind of professional smile that managed to be both warm and impersonal. Have a pleasant flight, Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen. Not Mom, not the woman slowing everyone down, not the burden trailing behind her successful son and his perfectly organized wife. Just Mrs. Chen, a person with a name and a ticket and the same right to board this plane as anyone else. I walked down the jetway, my footsteps echoing against the metal walls. Ahead of me, David and Sarah moved with purpose, already discussing their plans for the Denver conference in voices that didn't include me. Behind me, other passengers shuffled forward, each carrying their own stories, their own destinations, and their own complicated relationships with the people they traveled alongside. The airplane cabin smelled of recycled air and industrial carpet. I found my row, 14, just behind David and Sarah in 13. The middle seat, as promised. I stowed my bag in the overhead compartment, aware that I was taking perhaps 30 seconds longer than optimal, aware that this delay would likely be catalogued and referenced later. As I settled into my seat, I caught a fragment of conversation from the row ahead. She'll be fine, Sarah was saying. It's just a 3-hour flight. I know, David replied. But you know how she gets. Anxious about everything. I fastened my seatbelt and stared out the small window past the passenger in the window seat, a young woman absorbed in her phone, earbuds blocking out the world. Through the scratched plastic, I could see the ground crew loading luggage, their movements efficient and purposeful. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, beginning the standard pre-flight announcements. Weather conditions, flight time, and cruising altitude. Then, unexpectedly, we'd also like to extend a special welcome to Mrs. Margaret Chen, who's traveling with us today on her first trip to Denver. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. But the woman next to me glanced over with a smile. That's nice, she said. Is it really your first time? Yes, I managed. David's head appeared over the seat back, his expression a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. Mom, did you tell them it was your first time flying to Denver? No, I said quietly. I didn't tell them anything. But as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, I realized something had shifted. For just a moment, my name had been spoken aloud in a space where I mattered. Not as someone's mother or someone's burden, but as Margaret Chen, a person worthy of welcome. The engines grew louder, and I closed my eyes as we lifted off. Below us, the city grew smaller, the neat grid of streets and buildings shrinking until they looked like a child's toy set. Up here, the whispered words seemed smaller too, less sharp, less capable of drawing blood. Silence can bruise louder than shouting, I thought, watching the clouds gather outside the window. But sometimes, unexpectedly, a voice can heal just as quietly. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers around me began the familiar ritual of reaching for phones, adjusting air vents, and settling in for the flight ahead. But I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my mind already racing ahead to what waited beyond this airplane, beyond Denver, beyond the careful choreography of family obligation. Something had cracked open in that moment when the pilot spoke my name. Not broken, cracked, like an egg ready to hatch, like a seed splitting to let in light. The woman beside me, Linda, she'd introduced herself, was reading a paperback novel with a bright yellow cover. The kind of book I used to read before I'd somehow convinced myself that my time was better spent anticipating other people's needs, managing other people's schedules, and smoothing other people's paths. Good book? I asked. She looked up, surprised by the question. Oh, yes. It's about a woman who inherits a house in Italy and decides to start over. She paused, studying my face. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, I said, though I wasn't sure what I meant. Through the gap between seats, I could see the back of David's head, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his shoulders set in the same rigid line they'd held since childhood whenever he was determined to prove a point. Sarah's blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, not a strand out of place, despite the early morning flight. They were discussing the conference schedule, their voices low but carrying in the recycled air. Sessions on market analysis, networking dinners, and strategic planning meetings. A world of acronyms and objectives that had once seemed important when David first started climbing the corporate ladder, when I'd been so proud of his success that I'd forgotten to notice how little space it left for anything, or anyone, else. Within days, I whispered to myself, testing the words, the locks would turn differently. Linda glanced over again. Sorry? Nothing, I said. Just thinking out loud. But the words had weight, substance. They felt like a promise I was making to myself, though I wasn't yet sure what it meant or how I'd keep it. The flight attendant came by with the beverage cart, her movements practiced and efficient. Something to drink? Tea, please, I said. With honey, if you have it. She handed me a small cup, the liquid steaming despite the plastic lid. I wrapped my hands around it, feeling the warmth seep through the thin material. Such a simple thing, tea. But it was mine, chosen by me, sweetened to my taste. No one had asked me to make it for them, and no one had criticized the temperature or suggested I was taking too long. I thought about my kitchen at home, about the morning ritual I'd performed for 37 years, David's coffee first, black with 1 sugar, then tea for myself if there was time. How many mornings had I skipped the tea because someone needed something, because there was a schedule to keep? After all, my small comfort seemed less important than everyone else's urgency. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, a gentle rocking that made Linda grip her armrest. But I found it oddly soothing, this reminder that even in our carefully controlled environment, some forces couldn't be managed or predicted or accommodated. Some things simply were what they were. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver, the pilot announced. Local time is 10:47 a.m., and it's a beautiful, clear day with temperatures in the mid-60s. I looked out the window at the approaching city, the mountains rising beyond it like ancient guardians. Somewhere down there was a hotel room with my name on the reservation, a conference I'd been invited to attend not as David's mother but as Margaret Chen, retired librarian, lifetime learner, and person of independent means and interests. It had been my idea to come, though David had quickly taken over the planning, booking our flights together and arranging ground transportation, and mapping out the most efficient routes between the hotel and the convention center. Efficiency was his specialty, after all. What he'd never learned was that efficiency and kindness weren't mutually exclusive, that taking care of logistics didn't require treating people like cargo. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and around me, passengers began the ritual of gathering belongings, checking phones, and preparing to rejoin their lives on the ground. David and Sarah were already standing, pulling bags from the overhead compartment with the practiced ease of people who traveled frequently and well. "Mom," David called over his shoulder, "make sure you have everything. We need to move quickly to catch the shuttle." I remained seated, finishing my tea. The cup was still warm in my hands, the honey still sweet on my tongue. Around me, the plane was emptying, but I wasn't ready to rush back into the familiar pattern of following, accommodating, and apologizing for taking up space. "Mom," David's voice carried a note of impatience now. "Come on." "I'm coming," I said, but I didn't move. "Not yet." Linda had gathered her things and was waiting in the aisle. She looked back at me with something that might have been understanding. "Take your time," she said quietly. "The shuttle will wait." And in that moment, I realized she was right. The shuttle would wait, or there would be another shuttle. The conference would begin when it began, regardless of whether I arrived 5 minutes early or 5 minutes late. The world would not collapse if Margaret Chen moved at her own pace for once. I stood slowly, retrieved my bag, and walked toward the exit. David and Sarah were already at the gate, checking their phones, their body language radiating barely contained frustration. But I wasn't hurrying. Not today. In 7 days, I thought, even a door can grow new teeth. The flight home 3 days later passed in a blur of recycled air and careful politeness. David and Sarah discussed the conference sessions they'd attended, the contacts they'd made, and the follow-up meetings already being scheduled. I listened with the part of my mind trained to nod at appropriate intervals while the rest of me remained somewhere else entirely. In that moment when the pilot had spoken my name, in the quiet space I'd found between the shuttle and the hotel lobby, and in the realization that I could move through the world at my own pace. Now I stood in my kitchen, the familiar weight of homecoming settling around my shoulders like an old coat. The house felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closer together, the air thicker with the accumulated silence of years. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the blue flame catching with its usual soft whoosh. The sound was comforting in its predictability, but something felt different about the ritual. I wasn't making tea because someone else needed coffee first and wasn't checking the clock to see if I had time before the next task demanded attention. I was making tea because I wanted tea. After all, the simple act of choosing something for myself had become, somehow, revolutionary. The bread box sat on the counter where it always had, next to the ceramic jar that held wooden spoons and the small pot where I kept loose change. I pulled out a slice of the whole grain loaf I'd baked before leaving for Denver. It was still fresh, still soft when I pressed it gently with my fingertip. I'd always been good at timing things to last, at planning, at making sure there was enough for everyone. The kettle began its low whistle, and I poured the water over the tea bag, watching the amber color bloom through the clear liquid. Steam rose from the cup, carrying the familiar scent of bergamot and comfort. I added honey, not because anyone had asked me to, not because it was expected, but because I liked the way it softened the edges of the Earl Grey. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Patterson's garden next door, her marigolds bright orange against the dark soil. She'd planted them in neat rows, each flower given space to bloom without crowding its neighbors. I'd always admired her garden but had never found time to plant one of my own. There was always something else that needed doing, someone else who needed tending. The front door opened and closed with David's particular combination of efficiency and barely contained irritation. His footsteps moved through the house with purpose, dropping his suitcase in the hallway, hanging his coat in the closet, and checking the mail that had accumulated in our absence. Sarah's lighter steps followed, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. They appeared in the kitchen doorway together, David loosening his tie, Sarah checking her phone. The picture of a successful couple returning from a successful trip, already mentally organizing the next phase of their carefully structured lives. Good flight? I asked, though I'd been on the same plane. Fine, David said, opening the refrigerator and scanning its contents with the focused attention of someone conducting an inventory. Though the delay in Chicago was annoying. We could have made the earlier connection if, he stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. If I hadn't needed to use the restroom. If I hadn't stopped to help an elderly man who dropped his boarding pass. If I hadn't existed as a complicating factor in their streamlined travel experience. Sarah perched on one of the kitchen stools, her posture perfect even in casual clothes. The conference was excellent, she said, her voice carrying the bright efficiency she used for social interactions. So many valuable connections. David's presentation went very well. I'm sure it did, I said, and meant it. David had always been articulate, persuasive, and good at distilling complex ideas into digestible presentations. It was a skill that served him well in business and less well in family relationships, where some things couldn't be reduced to bullet points and action items. I buttered my bread slowly, deliberately, aware that my movements were being catalogued and found wanting. Too slow, too careful, too much attention paid to something as simple as spreading butter evenly across the surface. But the bread was warm from toasting, and the butter melted into golden pools, and for once I didn't care if I was taking too long. Mom, David said, his voice carrying that familiar note of patient exasperation, we need to talk about some things. The trip made it clear that there are some logistics we should discuss. I took a bite of my toast, chewing slowly. The bread was good, nutty and substantial, with just enough sweetness to balance the salt of the butter. I'd forgotten how satisfying it could be to eat something I'd made myself, to taste the care I'd put into the mixing and kneading and timing. What kind of logistics? I asked. Sarah and David exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that married couples develop, full of shared understanding and mutual reinforcement. It was the kind of look that excluded everyone else in the room, that made decisions without consultation, that assumed agreement before discussion. Well, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she used for difficult conversations, it's just that traveling together can be challenging. Different paces, different needs. Maybe it would be better if we planned separate trips in the future. The words landed softly, cushioned in reasonable language and practical considerations. But underneath the politeness was something sharper, something that cut with surgical precision. You're too slow. You're too much trouble. You're in the way. I set down my teacup, the china making a small sound against the saucer. The kitchen felt very quiet suddenly, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I see, I said. It's not personal, David added quickly, though of course it was entirely personal. It's just more efficient this way. Less complicated. Less complicated. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be considered. As if my presence in their lives was a logistical challenge rather than a relationship worth nurturing. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and tried to find traces of the boy who used to help me in this same kitchen, who would stand on a step stool to reach the mixing bowls, who would carefully measure ingredients while I guided his small hands. That boy had been patient with my pace and had found joy in the slow process of creating something together. More tea? I asked, though neither of them had requested any. We should get going, Sarah said, sliding off the stool with practiced grace. Early day tomorrow. They gathered their things with the efficiency of people accustomed to making quick exits, leaving behind only the faint scent of Sarah's perfume and the echo of words that would settle into the silence long after their car pulled out of the driveway. I sat alone at the kitchen table, my tea growing cold, my toast half-eaten. Outside, Mrs. Patterson's marigolds caught the late afternoon light, their bright faces turned toward the sun with unwavering optimism. Small humiliations stack like unwashed cups, I thought, looking at the delicate china teacup in my hands. Each one seemed insignificant on its own, but together they created a tower that threatened to topple at the slightest touch. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. This kitchen had witnessed 37 years of family meals, homework sessions, birthday celebrations, and quiet conversations over morning coffee. The scratches on the wooden table told stories, David's science projects, Sarah's wedding planning, and countless ordinary moments that had seemed important at the time. But now the scratches looked different, like evidence of a life that had been lived around other people's needs, other people's schedules, and other people's definitions of what mattered. When had I stopped being a participant in my own life and become merely a supporting character in everyone else's story? I finished my tea slowly, savoring the last drops that had cooled to the perfect temperature. The bergamot lingered on my tongue, familiar and comforting. Through the window, the light was beginning to shift toward evening, painting everything in softer tones. Mrs. Patterson appeared in her garden, a small watering can in her hand. She moved among her marigolds with the careful attention of someone who understood that beautiful things required patience, that growth couldn't be rushed or optimized or made more efficient. She looked up and saw me watching and raised her hand in a friendly wave. I waved back, and for a moment we were just two women tending to our respective spaces, she to her flowers, and I to my thoughts. There was something peaceful about the exchange, something that asked nothing more than acknowledgement, that offered connection without complication. The kitchen grew quieter as the day faded. I washed my teacup and saucer, dried them carefully, and placed them back in the cabinet where they belonged. The simple ritual felt different now, less like an obligation and more like a choice. I was caring for these things because they were mine, because they deserved care, and because the act of tending to them was itself a form of respect. I pulled out a small notebook from the drawer where I kept shopping lists and phone numbers. The pages were mostly blank, waiting for something important enough to record. I uncapped a pen and wrote at the top of the first page, "Things that are mine." The words looked strange on the paper, bold and definitive in a way that felt both foreign and necessary. I stared at them for a long moment, then closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. But the words remained, echoing in the quiet kitchen like a promise I wasn't quite ready to make but couldn't quite forget. Outside, Mrs. Patterson finished watering her marigolds and disappeared into her house, leaving the garden to settle into evening shadows. I turned off the kitchen light and walked through the house, checking locks, adjusting thermostats, and performing the small rituals of security that had become second nature over the years. But tonight, each action felt deliberate rather than automatic, chosen rather than compulsory. In my bedroom, I changed into comfortable clothes and sat by the window that looked out over the backyard. The space was neat and well-maintained but somehow empty, like a stage set waiting for actors who never arrived. I'd always meant to plant a garden back there, to create something beautiful and growing and entirely my own. Maybe it wasn't too late. The thought surprised me with its quiet insistence. Maybe it wasn't too late for a lot of things. The notebook lay open on my kitchen table like a door I'd been afraid to walk through. 3 days had passed since I'd written those 4 words, "Things that are mine," and they seemed to have grown larger in the interim, more insistent, and more demanding of attention. Rain streaked the windows, turning the world outside into an impressionist painting of blurred colors and soft edges. Mrs. Patterson's marigolds drooped under the weight of water, but they would spring back when the sun returned. They always did. There was something to be learned from that resilience, that ability to bend without breaking. I made my morning tea with deliberate care, choosing the good china instead of the everyday mug, adding honey with the silver spoon that had been my mother's. Small luxuries that I'd saved for special occasions that never seemed to arrive. But this morning felt different, charged with possibility in a way that made ordinary moments seem worth celebrating. The pen felt substantial in my hand as I opened the notebook to that first page. Below the heading I'd written 3 days ago, I began to add items, each one a small act of reclamation. My time in the morning is before anyone else needs anything. The words flowed more easily than I'd expected, as if they'd been waiting just beneath the surface, ready to emerge when given permission. My choice of books is to read at my own pace. My preference for tea over coffee, for quiet over noise. My right to move slowly when I want to savor something. Each line felt like a small rebellion, a gentle but firm assertion of selfhood that had been buried under years of accommodation and compromise. I wasn't writing anything revolutionary, just simple truths about preferences and boundaries that should have been obvious but had somehow become radical. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with increasing urgency. I pulled my cardigan closer and continued writing, the scratch of pen against paper creating its own rhythm. My memories of who I was before I became someone's mother, someone's burden. That line surprised me with its honesty. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if I should cross it out or soften it somehow. But it was true, and truth deserved to be acknowledged even when it was uncomfortable. My right to take up space without apologizing. My voice in conversations about my own life. My name, spoken with respect rather than impatience. The list grew longer, each item building on the last, creating a foundation of selfhood that felt both foreign and familiar. These weren't demands or ultimatums, they were simply acknowledgments of things that had always belonged to me but that I'd somehow forgotten how to claim. I thought about the conference in Denver, about the moment when the pilot had announced my name. Such a small thing, but it had cracked something open inside me, letting light into spaces that had been dark for too long. I'd spent 3 days walking through that conference as Margaret Chen, not as David's mother or anyone's obligation. I'd attended sessions that interested me, struck up conversations with strangers, and eaten meals at my own pace without anyone checking their watch or suggesting I hurry. My right to travel at my own speed, to my own destinations. My choice to say no without providing detailed explanations. My decision to prioritize my own comfort occasionally. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that accompanied his calls, the immediate assumption that I'd done something wrong or forgotten something important. "Hi, David," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Mom, I need you to do me a favor." No greeting, no inquiry about my well-being, just straight to the request. "Sarah's mother is coming to visit next week, and we need you to take her to that doctor's appointment on Thursday. The one we talked about." I didn't remember talking about any doctor's appointment, but that wasn't unusual. Many conversations happened around me rather than with me, and decisions were made and communicated as if my agreement was assumed rather than requested. "What time?" I asked, though something in me resisted the automatic compliance. 2 o'clock. "It's just a routine checkup, but you know how she gets anxious about driving in the city." I looked down at my notebook, at the list I'd been building, at the words that seemed to pulse with quiet insistence. My choice to say no without providing detailed explanations. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "I can't do that." Silence stretched across the phone line, filled with David's surprise and growing irritation. "What do you mean you can't? You don't have anything else going on?" The assumption stung, but it also clarified something. In David's mind, my time was space waiting to be filled with other people's needs, my schedule a blank canvas for other people's priorities. "I have plans," I said simply. "What plans?" The question carried an edge of disbelief, as if the idea of me having independent plans was inherently suspicious. I looked out at the rain, at Mrs. Patterson's garden, at the world that continued to exist and change and offer possibilities regardless of whether I was available to chauffeur someone to a doctor's appointment. "Personal plans," I said. Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear David recalibrating, trying to understand this unexpected resistance from someone who had never said no before. "Mom, this is important. Sarah's mother specifically asked for you." "I'm sure she did. But I'm not available." The words felt powerful in a way that surprised me. Not angry or defensive, just clear. A simple statement of fact that required no justification or elaborate explanation. "Fine," David said, his voice tight with frustration. "I'll figure something else out." The line went dead, and I set the phone down with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, washing the world clean. I returned to my notebook, to the list that was becoming a manifesto of small freedoms. At the bottom of the page, I added one more line. Things I no longer owe, explanations, apologies, and keys to my own life. The words looked bold on the paper, definitive in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, but I knew I'd return to it. The list wasn't finished, it was just beginning. Through the window, I watched a single marigold in Mrs. Patterson's garden lift its face toward the gray sky, bright and defiant against the gloom. Rain or shine, it would continue to bloom, continue to claim its space in the world with quiet persistence. I could learn from that kind of courage. The manila binder had lived in the bottom drawer of my desk for 15 years, growing thicker with each passing year as statements and documents accumulated like sediment. I'd always meant to organize it properly, to create some system that made sense, but there had always been something more urgent demanding attention. Now, spread across my dining room table, the papers told the story of a life lived in careful increments. Bank statements showing modest but steady deposits from my library pension. Investment accounts that David had helped me set up, though I'd never quite understood the allocation strategy he'd recommended. Insurance policies with beneficiaries I hadn't reviewed in years. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Through the dining room window, I could see Mrs. Patterson in her garden, deadheading the marigolds with gentle precision. She worked slowly and methodically, taking time to examine each plant before deciding what needed attention. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes, creating categories that made sense to me rather than following the complex filing system David had suggested years ago. Checking accounts, savings, investments, insurance, and property documents. Simple headings for what had seemed like incomprehensible complexity. The numbers, when I added them up, surprised me. Not because they were large, they weren't, but because they were mine. Accumulated through years of careful saving, modest living, and the kind of financial prudence that came from growing up with parents who remembered the Depression. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't dependent either. Somehow, in all the years of being treated as if I couldn't manage my own affairs, I'd forgotten that I actually could. The bank sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, a solid brick building that had weathered decades of economic ups and downs with the stolid persistence of institutions built to last. I'd been banking there for 23 years, since moving to this town, but I'd always conducted my business quickly and efficiently, trying not to take up too much of anyone's time. Today felt different. I walked through the heavy glass doors with my binder under my arm and my list of questions in my purse, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had every right to be there. Mrs. Chen, the teller smiled as I approached her window. How can I help you today? I'd like to speak with someone about my accounts, I said. I want to make sure I understand all my options. She directed me to a desk where a young man in a crisp shirt and tie introduced himself as Marcus, an account specialist. He had kind eyes and the sort of patient demeanor that suggested he genuinely enjoyed helping people navigate financial complexity. What can I do for you today, Mrs. Chen? I opened my binder, revealing the neat stacks of papers I'd organized that morning. I want to understand exactly what I have and what I can do with it. I've been letting other people manage things for me, and I think it's time I took a more active role. Marcus nodded, his expression serious but encouraging. That's a great approach. Financial literacy is so important, especially for people planning their retirement years. He walked me through each account with careful attention, explaining terms I'd never fully understood, showing me how to access online banking, and discussing options I hadn't known existed. His tone was respectful and professional, treating me as an intelligent adult capable of making informed decisions about my own money. You're in a very solid position, he said after reviewing everything. Conservative investments, good cash reserves, no debt. You've done an excellent job managing your finances. The words settled into a place inside me that had been empty for too long. I'd done an excellent job. Not David, not some financial advisor, but me. The woman who supposedly couldn't be trusted to manage her own travel schedule had actually been managing her money quite competently for decades. I'd like to set up online access, I said. And I want to understand more about my investment options. Absolutely. We can get you set up right now. As Marcus walked me through the online banking system, showing me how to check balances, transfer funds, and monitor my accounts, I felt something shifting inside me. Each password I created, each security question I answered, was a small act of reclamation. These were my accounts, my decisions, and my financial future. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Marcus asked as we finished the setup. I thought about the list in my notebook, about the things I was learning to claim as mine. Actually, yes. I'd like to add a safe deposit box to my account. Of course. What size would you prefer? Something small. I just want a place to keep important documents. Things that are mine. He led me to the vault, a secure room lined with metal boxes of various sizes. The one he showed me was modest but sufficient, a private space where I could store things that mattered, things that belonged to me alone. As I signed the paperwork, I thought about what I might put in this box. Not just documents, but perhaps letters I wanted to keep private, photographs that told my story rather than everyone else's, and small treasures that had meaning only to me. Here's your key, Marcus said, handing me a small silver key that felt substantial in my palm. And remember, you're the only one who can access this box unless you specifically authorize someone else. The key was warm from his hand, and I closed my fingers around it carefully. Such a small thing, but it represented something larger, a space that was entirely mine, a boundary that couldn't be crossed without my permission. Walking back to my car, I felt different. Not transformed exactly, but more solid somehow, more present in my own life. The binder under my arm contained the same papers it had that morning, but now I understood what they meant, what they represented, and what possibilities they contained. I wasn't old, I was original. The thought came unbidden, surprising me with its clarity. I wasn't a burden or a complication, or a problem to be managed. I was a person with resources and options and the right to make my own decisions about how to use them. The drive home took me past the library where I'd worked for 22 years, past the grocery store where I'd shopped for decades, and past the small businesses and familiar landmarks that made up the geography of my daily life. But today they looked different, less like the boundaries of a small world and more like the foundation of a life I was just beginning to understand I could reshape. At home, I placed the safe deposit box key on my keyring, next to the house key and car key that had been my only companions for so long. 3 keys now, each one opening something different, each one representing a different kind of access to the world. I updated my notebook that evening, adding new lines to my growing list. My right to understand and control my own finances. My ability to make decisions about my own resources. My private space that belongs to no one else. The list was getting longer, more specific, and more confident. Each item built on the last, creating a foundation of selfhood that felt increasingly solid, increasingly real. Outside, the evening light caught Mrs. Patterson's marigolds, their bright faces turned toward the setting sun with unwavering optimism. Tomorrow they would face the sun again, claiming their space in the garden with quiet persistence. I was learning to do the same. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening, arriving with the same sudden intensity as the thunderstorm that had been building all day. I'd been reading in my chair by the window, a novel I'd chosen for myself rather than one from David's recommended list, when I heard his car in the driveway. The front door opened with more force than necessary, followed by the sharp click of Sarah's heels on the hardwood floor. Their voices carried from the entryway, David's clipped tones mixing with Sarah's higher pitch in the particular harmony of shared irritation. I marked my place in the book and set it aside, though something in me resisted the automatic response to make myself available for whatever crisis had brought them here unannounced. The novel was good, a story about a woman who'd inherited a vineyard in France and decided to learn winemaking despite having no experience. The kind of book I'd always dismissed as frivolous but was discovering held its own quiet wisdom about courage and new beginnings. Mom? David's voice carried the edge it took on when he was trying to control his temper. We need to talk. They appeared in the living room doorway together, David still in his work clothes, Sarah perfectly put together despite the late hour. The storm outside chose that moment to announce itself with a low rumble of thunder, as if the weather itself was commenting on the tension that had followed them into my house. Of course, I said, though I didn't rise from my chair. What's on your mind? David moved to the center of the room with the restless energy of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Sarah positioned herself near the mantelpiece, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested strong opinions held in check. We got a call from the bank today, David said without preamble. Apparently, you've been making changes to your accounts without discussing them with anyone. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for him to continue, though part of me wanted to point out that my accounts were, by definition, mine to change as I saw fit. Marcus Chen, no relation, apparently, called to verify some information, Sarah added, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while delivering criticism. He mentioned that you'd been asking about investment options and had opened a safe deposit box. That's correct, I said simply. David's jaw tightened. Mom, we've talked about this. Financial decisions shouldn't be made in isolation. There are tax implications, estate planning considerations, and things you might not fully understand. The assumption stung, but I kept my voice level. What exactly don't I understand? It's not about understanding, Sarah interjected smoothly. It's about having a comprehensive strategy. David has an MBA, after all. He's qualified to help you make these decisions. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark black and white for a moment before returning us to the warm glow of the table lamps. The storm was getting closer, and I could feel the electricity in the air, the sense of something building toward an inevitable release. I appreciate David's qualifications, I said carefully. But these are my accounts. My decisions to make. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people into trouble, David said, his voice rising slightly. You can't just make financial moves without considering the bigger picture. What if you need long-term care? What if there are medical expenses? What if I'm capable of making my own decisions about my own life? The words came out more sharply than I'd intended, cutting through his litany of hypothetical disasters. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. David stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that looked uncomfortably like anger. This isn't like you, Sarah said, her voice taking on the concerned tone she used when she wanted to sound caring while delivering a diagnosis. You've always been so sensible about these things. So willing to accept guidance. So willing to be managed, she meant. So compliant, so grateful for their attention, and so eager to avoid conflict that I'd handed over my autonomy piece by piece without even noticing it was gone. Maybe this is exactly like me, I said. Maybe you just haven't been paying attention. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to rattle the windows. The storm had arrived in earnest now, bringing with it the kind of elemental force that made human concerns seem small and temporary. David began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. I don't understand what's gotten into you lately. First, the thing with Sarah's mother's appointment, now this. It's like you're deliberately trying to make things difficult. I'm trying to make things honest, I said. What's that supposed to mean? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and tried to find traces of the boy who used to curl up in this same chair with me, who would listen to stories and ask questions and treat my opinions as if they mattered. That boy had grown into a successful man, but somewhere along the way, he'd also grown into someone who confused control with care, who mistook management for love. It means I'm tired of being treated like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. The words landed in the room like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in widening circles. Sarah's carefully composed expression flickered, revealing something harder underneath. David stopped pacing and turned to face me fully, his eyes bright with frustration. "That's not fair," he said. "Everything we do is because we care about you. Because we want what's best for you." "What do you think is best for me?" I corrected gently. "Without asking what I think is best for me. Because you don't always see the whole picture." The words exploded out of him, carrying years of accumulated frustration. "You get focused on small things and miss the bigger implications. Like this bank thing, you're making decisions that could affect your entire financial future without considering your opinion," I finished. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not my financial security, but your need to be consulted, to be in control, to have your expertise acknowledged." Sarah stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "That's incredibly unfair, Margaret. David has spent years trying to help you, trying to make sure you're taken care of, and this is how you repay him? By shutting him out and making reckless decisions? Reckless decisions like understanding my own bank accounts? Like having a private space for my personal documents? Like saying no to an appointment I never agreed to in the first place?" The storm outside reached its crescendo, rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. But inside the living room, a different kind of storm was building, fed by years of unspoken resentments and unexamined assumptions. "You're being selfish," David said, his voice cold now, controlled in the way that was somehow more cutting than shouting. "You're thinking only about yourself instead of considering how your actions affect the people who care about you." The accusation hit its mark, finding the place inside me that had always been vulnerable to guilt, to the suggestion that my needs were somehow less important than everyone else's comfort. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to return to the easier path of accommodation. But then I thought about the list in my notebook, about the things I was learning to claim as mine. About the key in my purse that opened a space that belonged to no one but me. About the novel on the table beside me, chosen for my own pleasure rather than someone else's approval. "Control mistakes itself for care," I said quietly. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Outside, the storm was beginning to move on, the thunder growing more distant, the rain settling into a steadier, gentler rhythm. David and Sarah stood frozen in the center of my living room, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and something that might have been recognition. For just a moment, I saw them clearly, not as the villains in my story, but as people who had genuinely believed they were helping, who had confused their own need to be needed with my need to be cared for. "I think you should go," I said, not unkindly but with finality. They left without another word, gathering their coats and their wounded dignity, their footsteps echoing through the house and out into the storm. I remained in my chair, listening to their car start and pull away, listening to the rain settle into its gentler rhythm against the windows. The living room felt larger somehow, as if the confrontation had cleared the air of more than just harsh words. I picked up my novel and found my place, but the words blurred slightly as I read. Not from tears, I wasn't crying, but from something that felt like relief mixed with exhaustion. The storm moved on, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed air and the sound of water dripping from the eaves. In the morning, Mrs. Patterson's marigolds would lift their faces toward the sun again, resilient and bright despite the battering they'd received. I was learning that kind of resilience, too. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made everything look newly washed and full of possibility. I took my tea outside to the small patio behind the kitchen, something I rarely did but which felt necessary today, as if I needed to breathe air that hadn't been contaminated by last night's harsh words. Mrs. Patterson was already in her garden, assessing the damage from the storm with the practical eye of someone who'd weathered many seasons. Her marigolds had taken a beating, several stems broken, petals scattered across the dark soil, but she moved among them with gentle efficiency, supporting what could be saved, clearing away what couldn't. Good morning, Margaret, she called over the low fence that separated our properties. Quite a storm last night. Good morning, Eleanor. Yes, it was intense. She straightened, brushing soil from her gardening gloves, and studied my face with the kind of attention that suggested she'd heard more than just weather in my voice. Eleanor Patterson had lived next door for 8 years, and in all that time our conversations had been pleasant but surface level, discussions of weather and neighborhood news, the comfortable exchanges of people who respected each other's privacy. But something in her expression today suggested deeper waters, a willingness to venture beyond the safe shores of small talk. Would you like to sit for a moment? She asked, gesturing toward a small wooden bench positioned under an old oak tree that straddled the property line. I was just about to take a break. The bench had been there for as long as I could remember, weathered to a soft gray that spoke of years of sun and rain and patient endurance. I'd always admired it but had never been invited to share it, had never thought to ask. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Eleanor disappeared into her house and returned with a thermos and 2 cups, settling beside me on the bench with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to taking time for simple pleasures. She poured tea from the thermos, something herbal that smelled of chamomile and honey, and handed me a cup without asking if I wanted any. I heard voices last night, she said without preamble. During the storm. Sounded like it was coming from your house. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to hold. My son and his wife came by. We had a disagreement. Eleanor sipped her tea thoughtfully. Those can be the hardest kind. Family disagreements. They carry so much history, so many assumptions about who we're supposed to be. The observation was gentle but perceptive, cutting straight to the heart of what had made last night so difficult. It wasn't just about bank accounts or safe deposit boxes, it was about the fundamental question of who I was allowed to be in my own life. I've been making some changes, I said carefully. Small ones, really. But David seems to think I'm being reckless. Changes like what? The question was asked without judgment, with the kind of genuine curiosity that invited honesty rather than defensiveness. I found myself telling Eleanor about the conference in Denver, about the pilot announcing my name, about the list I'd been writing, and about the bank visit and the safe deposit box key that now lived on my keyring. She listened without interrupting, her attention complete and unhurried. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, watching a cardinal that had landed in the oak tree above us. You know, she said finally, I went through something similar when Harold died. Not the same circumstances, of course, but the same feeling of suddenly having to remember who I was underneath all the roles I'd been playing. Harold had been her husband of 43 years, a gentle man who'd tended the garden with the same patient care Eleanor showed now. I'd attended his funeral 2 years ago and had watched Eleanor stand beside his grave with quiet dignity, but I'd never thought to ask how she'd navigated the aftermath of such a profound loss. How did you manage it? I asked. Slowly, she said with a small smile. And with a lot of mistakes. I spent the first year trying to be the same person I'd always been, just without Harold. It took me a while to realize that wasn't possible, or even desirable. I had to figure out who Eleanor was when she wasn't half of Harold and Eleanor. She gestured toward her garden, toward the neat rows of marigolds and the small vegetable patch that hadn't existed when Harold was alive. I planted things I wanted to plant, not things we'd agreed on together. I rearranged the furniture to suit my preferences instead of our compromises. I started reading books Harold would have found boring. Did people think you were being disrespectful to his memory? Some did. His sister certainly had opinions about the changes I made. But I realized that the best way to honor what we'd had together was to honor who I was becoming without him. A witness is sometimes all a truth requires, I thought, watching Eleanor's face as she spoke. She wasn't offering advice or solutions, just recognition, the simple acknowledgement that my experience was valid, that my desire for autonomy was reasonable, and that my small acts of reclamation were worth defending. Your son loves you, she said gently. But love and respect aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the people who care about us most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing us clearly. The cardinal above us began to sing, its voice clear and strong in the morning air. Other birds joined in, a chorus of different voices creating something beautiful together without anyone conducting, organizing, or managing the performance. I keep thinking I should feel guilty, I admitted. For wanting things to be different. For not being grateful enough for their concern. Guilt is just fear wearing a disguise, Eleanor said. Fear that we're not good enough, that we don't deserve what we want, that other people's comfort is more important than our own truth. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our tea and watching the garden come alive in the morning sun. The storm damage looked less severe in daylight, most of the marigolds would recover, and the ones that wouldn't could be replanted. Would you like to help me with the garden sometime? Eleanor asked as we finished our tea. I could use an extra pair of hands, and I think you might enjoy it. The invitation was simple, uncomplicated by expectations or obligations. Just one person offering to share something she loved with another person who might appreciate it. I'd like that very much, I said. As I walked back to my house, I felt something had shifted. Not dramatically, I was still the same person who'd woken up that morning, still facing the same challenges with David and Sarah, still learning to navigate the unfamiliar territory of putting myself first. But I was no longer alone in that territory. Eleanor's quiet recognition had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, the simple validation that my experience was real, that my desires were legitimate, and that my small acts of courage were worth celebrating. I updated my notebook that afternoon, adding a new line to my growing list. My right to be witnessed and understood without judgment. The words looked different from the others, softer somehow, more about connection than independence. But they belonged there, part of the foundation I was building for a life that honored both my need for autonomy and my need for community. Outside, Eleanor worked in her garden with patient persistence, tending to what could be saved, clearing away what couldn't, and making space for new growth. The marigolds that had survived the storm seemed brighter somehow, their colors more vivid against the dark soil. I was learning to tend my own life with the same kind of care. The locksmith arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, a compact woman with calloused hands and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent years solving other people's security problems. She introduced herself as Rita and walked around my house with professional efficiency, examining doors and windows with the practiced eye of someone who understood that safety was about more than just keeping unwanted people out. It was about giving the right people control over who came in. Standard deadbolts on the front and back doors, she said, making notes on a small pad. Good quality, but they're about 15 years old. The side door to the garage has a basic knob lock, which isn't really secure. And you've got those old windows that don't lock properly. I followed her around the perimeter of my house, seeing it through her eyes, not as the familiar space I'd inhabited for decades, but as a structure with vulnerabilities, with points of access that could be controlled or compromised depending on who held the keys. What would you recommend? I asked. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Are you worried about break-ins, or is this more about controlling access? The question was more perceptive than she probably realized. This wasn't about burglars or home invasion, it was about something more fundamental. The question was more perceptive than she probably realized. This wasn't about burglars or home invasion, it was about something more fundamental. It was about the right to decide who entered my space and when, about creating boundaries that couldn't be crossed without my explicit permission. Controlling access, I said. Rita nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable request. In that case, I'd recommend new deadbolts with restricted keys, the kind that can't be duplicated without authorization. High-security cylinders that are harder to pick or bump. And we should definitely upgrade that side door. She quoted me a price that was higher than I'd expected but not unreasonable for what amounted to reclaiming sovereignty over my own home. I thought about the safe deposit box key on my keyring, about the bank account I now understood and controlled, and about the growing list in my notebook of things that belonged to me. Let's do it, I said. Rita worked with the methodical precision of someone who took pride in her craft. She removed the old locks carefully, explaining each step as she went, showing me the worn mechanisms that had been protecting my home with decreasing effectiveness over the years. "See how the pins are worn down here?" she said, holding up the old cylinder. "And this spring has lost most of its tension." These locks were doing their job, but they were getting tired. I watched her install the new hardware, the solid click of metal fitting into metal, and the smooth operation of mechanisms designed to last. Each lock she installed came with 2 keys, one for daily use and one for backup, and she handed them to me with the solemnity of someone transferring important responsibility. "These are restricted keys," she explained. "See this marking here? You can only get copies made at authorized dealers, and you'll need to show ID and sign for them. Nobody else can duplicate these without your permission." The keys felt substantial in my hand, heavier than the old ones, with a complexity of cuts and grooves that spoke of sophisticated engineering. But more than their physical weight, they carried the weight of choice, the power to decide who could enter my space and who couldn't. The side door was interesting, Rita said as she packed up her tools. "Looks like someone added a second lock to it at some point, but they never gave you the key. Just left it unlocked all these years." I stared at the side door, trying to remember when that second lock had appeared. It must have been years ago, installed by David during one of his periodic home improvement projects, another layer of security that had somehow become another layer of his control over my environment. "Can you make that one work too?" I asked. "Already did. Here's your key." She handed me a third key, smaller than the others but equally significant. The side door had been unlocked for so long that I'd forgotten it was supposed to be secure and had accepted that this entrance to my home was somehow beyond my control. After Rita left, I walked through my house testing each lock, feeling the solid engagement of metal against metal, the satisfying resistance that meant the mechanisms were working as designed. Each turn of the key was deliberate, purposeful, not just securing my home, but claiming it. The rain had started again, a gentle pattering against the windows that made the house feel cozy and protected. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, looking out at Eleanor's garden, where the marigolds were recovering from the storm, their bright faces turned toward what little sun filtered through the clouds. My phone rang, and David's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it ring 3 times before answering, not from spite but from the simple recognition that I didn't have to respond immediately to every demand for my attention. "Hi, David. Mom, I tried to stop by earlier, but your door was locked. I used my key, but it didn't work." His voice carried confusion and a note of irritation, as if my door's failure to open for him was a personal affront rather than the intended result of a deliberate decision. "I had the locks changed," I said simply. Silence stretched across the phone line, filled with his processing of this information and its implications. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's my house." "But what if there's an emergency? What if you need help and can't get to the door?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to highlight the supposed recklessness of my decision, to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my autonomy over his convenience. But I'd heard these arguments before, in different contexts, and I recognized them for what they were, attempts to maintain control disguised as concern for my welfare. "If there's an emergency, you can call 911 like anyone else," I said. "And if I invite you over, I'll unlock the door." "This is ridiculous, Mom. I'm your son. I should have a key to your house." "Why?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. Because that's how families work. Because I might need to check on you, or help with something, or because you're used to having access to my space whenever you want it, whether I'm home or not. Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear him recalibrating, trying to find an argument that would restore the status quo without making him sound controlling or unreasonable. "What if you fall and can't get up? What if you have a medical emergency? Then I'll use the medical alert system I'm going to look into. Or I'll call Eleanor next door. Or I'll handle it the way millions of other adults handle emergencies, by asking for help when I need it, not by giving other people unlimited access to my private space. The words came out more forcefully than I'd intended, but they felt true in a way that surprised me. I wasn't being reckless or stubborn, I was being reasonable. I was claiming the same right to privacy and security that any adult deserved, the same control over my environment that David took for granted in his own home. "I don't understand what's happening to you," David said, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't like you." "Maybe it is like me," I said. "Maybe you just haven't been paying attention." After he hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen listening to the rain and the subtle sounds of my house settling around me. The new locks were invisible from the inside, but I could feel their presence, solid, reliable, and responsive only to my keys and my decisions about who was welcome in my space. I pulled out my notebook and added a new line to my list. "A door answered only to me." The words looked powerful on the page, definitive in a way that felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. I'd crossed a line today, moving from internal changes to external ones, from private reclamation to public declaration. There would be consequences, more phone calls, more confrontations, more attempts to make me feel guilty for claiming what had always been mine. But as I sat in my secure house, listening to the rain wash the world clean outside my locked doors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged, protected by boundaries I'd chosen, surrounded by space that answered only to me. The key to the side door sat on my keyring next to the others, small but significant. For years, that door had been beyond my control, a symbol of all the ways my own home hadn't quite belonged to me. Now it was mine again, secured by my choice, opened only by my permission. A door answered only to me. The phrase echoed in my mind as the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, washing away the last traces of the storm and leaving everything clean and bright and new. The travel brochures had been accumulating in the kitchen drawer for months, colorful promises of places I'd always meant to visit but never quite found the time or courage to explore. Scotland, with its misty highlands and ancient castles. The coast of Maine, with its lighthouses and lobster boats. The wine country of California, where vineyards stretched toward distant mountains. I spread them across the kitchen table like a map of possibilities, each glossy page offering a different version of freedom. The morning light caught the photographs, azure waters, cobblestone streets, and gardens bursting with flowers I couldn't name. Places where I could be simply Margaret Chin, traveler, rather than someone's mother or burden or complication. The idea had been growing since Denver, since that moment when the pilot announced my name and I'd felt the strange thrill of being recognized as myself rather than as an appendage to someone else's life. But it had remained abstract until this morning, when I'd woken with the clear understanding that wanting something and doing something about it were two entirely different things. I pulled out the old atlas that had lived on the bookshelf for decades, its pages yellowed with age, but its information still largely accurate. The United States spread before me in careful detail, with state lines and major cities and the thin blue lines of rivers connecting everything. I'd driven most of these roads at one time or another, but always with purpose, always with a destination predetermined by someone else's needs or schedule. What would it be like to choose my own route, to stop when something caught my interest, and to change direction simply because a road looked inviting? The phone rang, interrupting my cartographic daydreaming. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that accompanied calls from David's family. But today the feeling was different, less automatic dread and more conscious choice about whether to engage. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, Sarah." "Margaret, I'm glad I caught you." Her voice carried the bright efficiency she used for difficult conversations. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened the other night. David is really upset, and I think there might be some misunderstanding about your recent decisions." I looked down at the travel brochures spread across my table, at the atlas open to a page showing the Pacific Coast Highway winding along the California shore. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "Well, the locks, for instance. David feels like you don't trust him, like you're shutting him out of your life. And the bank thing, He's worried you might be making financial decisions that could put you at risk. The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable while delivering their payload of guilt and doubt. But I'd heard this particular melody before, and I was learning to recognize the difference between genuine concern and manipulative control. I'm not shutting David out of my life, I said. I'm claiming my right to privacy in my own home. But what if something happens? What if you need help? Then I'll ask for it. The same way you would if you needed help. Silence stretched across the phone line, filled with Sarah's recalibration. I could almost hear her searching for a different approach, a new angle that might restore the familiar dynamic where my autonomy was negotiable and their convenience was paramount. David just wants what's best for you, she said finally. I'm sure he does. But what David thinks is best and what I think is best might be different things. And since it's my life, my opinion should probably carry some weight. After Sarah hung up, with promises to talk more later that sounded more like threats than invitations, I returned to my travel planning with renewed focus. The brochures suddenly seemed less like idle fantasy and more like practical possibilities, destinations that could be reached by someone with a reliable car, a valid credit card, and the courage to drive towards something new. I pulled out my laptop and began researching train routes, discovering a network of possibilities I'd never considered. The Coast Starlight from Seattle to Los Angeles, passing through forests and mountains and cities I'd only seen in photographs. The Empire Builder across the northern plains, through landscapes that changed with the seasons and the light. The Silver Star runs down the eastern seaboard, connecting cities with histories that stretch back centuries. Train travel appealed to me in a way that flying didn't, the ability to see the country unfold gradually, to watch the landscape change mile by mile, to arrive at destinations refreshed rather than exhausted. And there was something romantic about it, something that spoke to a part of me that had been dormant for too long. I clicked through schedules and prices, amazed at how accessible it all was. I could leave next week if I wanted to and could book a sleeper car to San Francisco, a coach seat to Chicago, or a room with a view on the route to New Orleans. The only thing stopping me was my own hesitation, my own ingrained habit of asking permission for things that required no one's approval but my own. The wooden drawer where I kept important papers yielded a surprise when I opened it to file the train schedules I'd printed. Tucked behind the insurance documents and warranty information was an envelope I'd forgotten about, a gift certificate for a bed and breakfast in Vermont that David and Sarah had given me for my birthday 2 years ago. For when you're ready to take a real vacation, the card had said, though somehow the timing had never seemed right. There was always something that needed attention, some reason why leaving town would be inconvenient or irresponsible or selfish. But the certificate was still valid, and Vermont in October would be beautiful, the leaves turning colors, the air crisp with the promise of winter, the small towns settling into the rhythm of harvest season. I could drive there in a day and could spend a week walking country roads, reading books, and eating meals I hadn't cooked myself. I called the bed and breakfast, half expecting them to tell me the certificate had expired or that they were booked solid through the fall. But the woman who answered the phone was warm and welcoming, delighted to help me plan a stay that could begin as early as next week. We have a lovely room available, she said. Corner windows with views of the mountains, and there's a reading nook with a fireplace. Perfect for someone who wants to relax and recharge. As I hung up the phone, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of momentum building, of decisions crystallizing into action. The train schedules lay beside the travel brochures, and the Vermont reservation confirmation would arrive in my email within the hour. What had been an abstract possibility was becoming a concrete plan. I updated my notebook that evening, adding a new line that felt different from all the others. Freedom can be printed on thin paper. The words referred to the train tickets I hadn't bought yet, the reservation confirmation that existed only as pixels on a screen, and the travel documents that would transform intention into reality. But they also spoke to something larger, the understanding that freedom wasn't a destination but a decision, not a place but a practice. Outside, the evening light caught Eleanor's marigolds, their bright faces turned toward the setting sun with the same unwavering optimism they'd shown all season. Tomorrow they would face the sun again, claiming their space in the garden with quiet persistence, blooming not because anyone expected them to but because blooming was what they did. I was learning to bloom in my own way, to turn toward the light of my own choosing, to claim space in the world not because anyone permitted me but because the space was mine to claim. The suitcase in my bedroom closet hadn't been used in years, but it was still sturdy, still capable of holding everything I'd need for a journey toward something new. Tomorrow I would pull it down and begin the pleasant ritual of packing, choosing clothes that made me feel confident, books that promised good company, and small luxuries that would make unfamiliar places feel welcoming. But tonight I sat with my travel plans and my growing sense of possibility, listening to the quiet sounds of my secure house and feeling the deep satisfaction of a life that was finally, truly, mine to live. The marigold-colored stationery had been a gift from Eleanor, part of a set she'd pressed into my hands after one of our morning conversations on the garden bench. For important correspondence, she'd said with a smile that suggested she understood the significance of having beautiful paper for beautiful thoughts. Now I sat at my kitchen table with a sheet of that stationery before me, the morning light catching the subtle texture of the paper and the warm gold of its color. My fountain pen, another small luxury I'd rediscovered in recent weeks, lay beside it, filled with ink the color of lilacs in spring. The letter I needed to write had been composing itself in my mind for days, ever since I'd made the reservation in Vermont and felt the first real stirring of departure. It wasn't an angry letter or a vindictive one, though I'd written several of those in my head during the darker moments of the past few weeks. This was something different, a letter that sought to close one chapter cleanly so that another could begin. Dear David, I wrote, the pen moving smoothly across the textured paper. By the time you read this, I'll be on my way to Vermont for a week of rest and reflection. I wanted to leave you with some thoughts about the changes I've been making and why they've been necessary. I paused, looking out the window at Eleanor's garden, where she was deadheading roses with the same patient attention she brought to all her gardening tasks. The morning was clear and bright, the kind of day that made everything seem possible. I know my recent decisions have been confusing and frustrating for you. The locks, the bank accounts, the boundaries I've been setting, they probably seem sudden and unreasonable. But they're not sudden at all. They're the result of years of gradually losing myself in the role of being your mother, of forgetting that I'm also Margaret Chen, a person with her own needs and desires and right to self-determination. The words flowed more easily than I'd expected, as if they'd been waiting just beneath the surface for permission to emerge. I wasn't writing to hurt or to blame, but to explain, to offer David the gift of understanding even if he wasn't ready to accept it. I love you deeply, and I'm proud of the man you've become. Your business success, your dedication to your family, your intelligence, and your drive, these are all qualities that bring me joy. But somewhere along the way, our relationship became less about love and more about management. I love you deeply, and I'm proud of the man you've become. Your business success, your dedication to your family, your intelligence, and your drive, these are all qualities that bring me joy. But somewhere along the way, our relationship became less about love and more about management. You began treating me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected, and I began accepting that treatment because it seemed easier than fighting for something I wasn't sure I deserved. I set down my pen for a moment and walked to the window, watching Eleanor work among her flowers. She moved with such purpose, such quiet confidence in her own judgment about what needed tending and what needed space to grow. There was a lesson in that kind of gardening, the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was step back and let something find its own way toward the light. The changes I've been making aren't about rejecting you or your care. They're about reclaiming the parts of myself that got lost in the process of being available for everyone else's needs. The woman who used to read poetry and dream about traveling to Scotland. The woman who had opinions about books, politics, and the best way to make tea. The woman deserved to be consulted about decisions affecting her own life. The fountain pen felt substantial in my hand as I continued writing, each word a small act of reclamation. The lilac ink flowed across the marigold paper like thoughts finally finding their proper expression. I understand that my independence might feel like rejection to you. When someone has been accustomed to managing another person's life, that person's autonomy can feel like abandonment. But love and control are not the same thing, David. Love trusts. Love respects. Love allows space for the other person to be fully themselves, even when that self is different from what we expected or preferred. Through the window, I could see a cardinal land in Eleanor's oak tree, its bright red feathers vivid against the green leaves. It sang for a moment, a clear, strong song that needed no accompaniment or approval, then flew away toward whatever destination called to it. I'm not asking you to understand all of my choices immediately. I'm asking you to respect my right to make them. I'm asking you to trust that the woman who raised you, who managed a household and a career for decades, who navigated the complexities of life with reasonable success, is still capable of making good decisions about her own welfare. The letter was longer than I'd intended, but each paragraph felt necessary, each thought a bridge between the relationship we'd had and the one I hoped we might build. I wasn't trying to punish David for his controlling behavior. I was trying to show him a different way forward, a path that honored both his love for me and my need for autonomy. The safe deposit box, the new locks, the financial independence, these aren't acts of rebellion. They're acts of self-respect. They're me finally claiming the space in my own life that should have been mine all along. I hope you can see them as signs of strength rather than stubbornness, as evidence of growth rather than ingratitude. I thought about the suitcase upstairs, already packed with clothes chosen for comfort and books selected for pleasure. The train ticket to Vermont sat in my purse, a small rectangle of paper that represented so much more than transportation. It was proof that I could choose my own destination, could move through the world at my own pace, and could trust myself to navigate unfamiliar territory. I'll be back in a week, and I hope we can talk then, really talk. Not just you explaining what you think I should do and me nodding along to keep the peace. I hope we can find a way to love each other that doesn't require either of us to be smaller than we are. The morning light had shifted while I wrote, moving across the kitchen table and illuminating the letter with warm golden rays. The marigold paper seemed to glow, and the lilac ink caught the light like tiny jewels scattered across the page. I want you to know that this journey I'm taking, both the literal trip to Vermont and the larger journey toward reclaiming myself, isn't about moving away from family. It's about moving toward the person I was meant to be, the person who can love you more fully because she loves herself enough to claim her own space in the world. Eleanor appeared at her back door, a cup of tea in her hands, and settled onto her garden bench with the satisfied air of someone who'd completed her morning tasks. She raised her cup in a small salute when she saw me at the window, and I waved back, grateful for her quiet presence in my life. Thank you for reading this, David. Thank you for being my son, for bringing joy and challenge and growth into my life in equal measure. I hope that someday you'll understand that the strongest love is the kind that sets people free to be themselves, that trusts them to make their own choices, and that celebrates their independence rather than fearing it. I signed the letter simply, with love and hope, Mom. The envelope was cream-colored, substantial enough to hold the weight of words that had taken years to find their proper form. I wrote David's name on the front in careful script, then placed the letter on the kitchen table where he would find it when he came by to check on the house, a habit I knew he wouldn't abandon despite the new locks. Closure doesn't slam doors, it latches them quietly, I thought, looking at the sealed envelope. This letter wasn't an ending but a beginning, not a rejection but an invitation to build something new on the foundation of honesty rather than habit. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, full of final preparations for tomorrow's departure. There were small tasks to complete, arrangements to make, and the pleasant ritual of preparing to step away from familiar routines and into the unknown. But first, I sat for a moment longer at the kitchen table, surrounded by the golden light and the sense of completion that came from finally saying what needed to be said. The letter would wait here while I was gone, a bridge between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. When I returned from Vermont, we would see what kind of relationship could be built on that bridge, what kind of love could flourish when it was rooted in respect rather than control. But that was for later. Today was for departure, for the sweet anticipation of a journey chosen freely, and for the deep satisfaction of a life finally, fully, my own to live. The suitcase sat by the front door like a faithful companion, packed with everything I needed for a week of independence and nothing I didn't. I'd chosen each item carefully: comfortable clothes that made me feel confident, books I'd been wanting to read, and the small luxuries that would make unfamiliar places feel welcoming. A silk scarf that my mother had given me years ago. The fountain pen that wrote so smoothly across good paper. A photograph of Eleanor's marigolds that I'd taken yesterday morning when the light was perfect. The house felt different around me as I moved through the familiar rooms, checking windows, and adjusting thermostats and performing the small rituals of departure. Not empty exactly, but expectant, as if it too understood that something significant was happening, that the woman who returned next week would not be quite the same as the one who was leaving. I'd called Eleanor earlier to let her know I was going, and she'd promised to keep an eye on things while I was away. Not because you need watching, she'd said with the gentle humor that characterized all our conversations, but because neighbors look out for each other. It's what we do. The distinction mattered. Eleanor's offer came from friendship rather than obligation, from respect rather than assumption. She wasn't taking responsibility for my life, she was simply extending the courtesy that one independent person offers another. The train would leave at 6:30, which meant I needed to be at the station by 6. I had time for one last cup of tea, one final moment of sitting in my kitchen and appreciating the space I'd worked so hard to reclaim as my own. The kettle whistled softly, and I poured water over the Earl Grey, watching the familiar amber color bloom through the clear liquid. Steam rose from the cup, carrying the scent of bergamot and comfort, of mornings spent in quiet contemplation and evenings spent in peaceful solitude. Through the window, I could see the porch light beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. I'd always loved this time of day, the gentle transition from afternoon to evening, the way the light softened everything and made ordinary moments feel touched with magic. I carried my tea outside to the small porch that faced the street, settling into the wicker chair I'd bought for myself last month. Another small luxury, another way of claiming space for my own comfort and pleasure. The chair was positioned perfectly to catch the evening light and watch the neighborhood settle into its nighttime rhythms. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was walking her small terrier, both of them moving with the unhurried pace of creatures who understood that the journey was as important as the destination. She waved when she saw me, and I waved back, grateful for these simple connections that asked nothing more than acknowledgement. The tea was perfect, not too hot, sweetened just the way I liked it, and served in the good china because every day was worth celebrating with beautiful things. I'd spent too many years saving the good china for special occasions that never seemed to arrive, forgetting that the decision to use beautiful things was itself what made occasions special. A car turned onto my street, its headlights sweeping across the pavement in the growing darkness. For a moment, I tensed, wondering if it might be David coming for another confrontation, another attempt to talk me out of the choices I'd been making. But the car continued past my house, carrying its occupants toward their own destinations, their own evening rituals. I thought about the letter I'd left on the kitchen table, about the words I'd finally found the courage to write. By the time David read it, I'd be somewhere in the mountains of Vermont, watching unfamiliar landscapes roll past the train window, breathing air that carried no history of compromise or accommodation. The porch light cast a warm circle of illumination around my chair, creating a small island of comfort in the gathering darkness. I'd always loved this light, the way it welcomed me home after long days, the way it suggested safety and warmth and belonging. Tonight it felt like something more, a beacon marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it without urgency. Eleanor wished me safe travels and reminded me that she'd be here when I returned. The message was brief but warm, carrying the kind of friendship that didn't need elaborate expressions to convey deep care. I finished my tea slowly, savoring each sip and the quiet satisfaction of sitting in my own space, on my own schedule, accountable to no one but myself. The evening air was cool but not cold, perfect for the light sweater I'd chosen for traveling. Everything felt aligned, purposeful, and ready. At 5:15, I stood and gathered my things. The suitcase rolled smoothly behind me as I walked to the car, its wheels making a soft sound against the pavement. I loaded it into the trunk with the careful attention of someone who understood that this simple act was also a ceremony, the physical manifestation of choosing to move towards something new. Before getting into the car, I turned back to look at my house. The porch light glowed warmly, illuminating the front steps where I'd sat so many evenings, the door that now opened only to my keys, and the windows that reflected my own choices about privacy and boundaries. It looked solid and welcoming and entirely mine. The drive to the train station took 20 minutes through streets I'd traveled thousands of times but which looked different tonight, touched with the magic of departure. I wasn't running away from anything, I was running toward something, toward the person I was meant to be when I stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own life. The station was busier than I'd expected, filled with people carrying their own stories of departure and arrival, their own reasons for choosing to move through the world at the measured pace of rail travel. I found my platform and settled onto a bench to wait, my suitcase beside me like a trusted friend. The train arrived exactly on time, its headlight cutting through the darkness as it pulled into the station with the solid authority of something built to last. The conductor helped me aboard with old-fashioned courtesy, and I found my seat by a window that would show me the world rolling past at exactly the right speed for contemplation. As the train pulled away from the station, I watched the lights of my town grow smaller and more distant. Somewhere back there, my house sat secure behind its new locks, my letter waited on the kitchen table, and Eleanor tended her garden with the patient wisdom of someone who understood that beautiful things required both care and space to grow. Departure can also be arrival, I thought, watching the familiar landscape give way to unfamiliar territory. I was leaving behind the woman who had spent decades accommodating other people's needs at the expense of her own and arriving at the understanding that love and respect were not mutually exclusive and that boundaries were not barriers but bridges to healthier relationships. The train settled into its rhythm, carrying me toward Vermont and toward whatever version of myself was waiting to be discovered there. Outside the window, the world rolled past in gentle darkness, full of possibilities I was finally ready to explore. The return journey began at a small station in Vermont, where morning mist clung to the mountains like a gentle blessing. I'd spent a week walking country roads and reading by fireplaces, eating meals I hadn't cooked and sleeping in a bed I hadn't made, remembering what it felt like to move through the world as simply Margaret Chin rather than someone's mother or obligation or concern. The bed and breakfast had been everything the website promised and more, a place where I could be anonymous if I chose or social if I preferred, where my schedule was my own, and my choices were respected without question. I'd talked with other guests about books and travel and the small pleasures of stepping away from routine. I'd sat in the garden with my morning tea and watched the leaves change color with the patient persistence of natural cycles that couldn't be rushed or managed or optimized. Now, settling into my seat on the southbound train, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone returning home by choice rather than obligation. The week had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, proof that I could navigate unfamiliar territory with confidence, that I could make decisions about my own comfort and safety, and that I could trust myself to know what I needed and when I needed it. The train pulled away from the station with the same measured authority I remembered from the journey north, carrying me back toward the life I'd left but with a clearer understanding of who I was within that life. The landscape rolled past the window in reverse, mountains giving way to hills, hills to farmland, and farmland to the suburbs and cities that marked the approach to home. I'd called Eleanor the night before to let her know when I'd be arriving, and she'd promised to pick me up at the station. Not because you can't get home on your own, she'd said with characteristic understanding, but because friends meet friends at train stations. It's what we do. The distinction still mattered. Eleanor's offer came from affection rather than assumption, from the kind of friendship that enhanced independence rather than threatening it. My phone had been mostly silent during the week away, a few text messages from David that I'd answered briefly but warmly, letting him know I was safe without providing detailed itineraries or justifications for my choices. The space had been good for both of us, I thought. Time for him to process the letter I'd left, time for me to remember who I was when I wasn't constantly managing other people's expectations. The train began its final approach to my home station, and I gathered my things with the unhurried movements of someone who had learned to trust her own timing. The suitcase that had been my companion for the week felt lighter somehow, as if the journey had stripped away unnecessary weight rather than adding to it. Now arriving at Central Station, the conductor announced over the intercom. Central Station, next stop. I smiled at the familiar words, remembering another announcement on another train that had started this whole journey toward reclaiming myself. How different that moment felt now, not the beginning of rebellion but the continuation of growth, not the rejection of family but the insistence on being treated as a full person within that family. The platform was busy with the usual mix of arrivals and departures, people carrying their own stories of where they'd been and where they were going. I stepped off the train with my suitcase and looked around for Eleanor, spotting her near the information booth with a smile that suggested genuine pleasure at my return. How was Vermont? She asked as we walked toward the parking garage, her question carrying the kind of interest that invited sharing without demanding details. Perfect, I said, and meant it. Exactly what I needed. The drive home took us through familiar streets that looked somehow brighter than I remembered, as if the week away had cleared my vision along with my thoughts. We talked easily about small things, the weather, the garden, the book Eleanor was reading, the comfortable conversation of friends who didn't need to fill every silence with words. My house came into view as we turned onto my street, the porch light glowing warmly in the afternoon sun. Eleanor had been watering my plants while I was away, and everything looked well tended, cared for with the same gentle attention she brought to her own garden. Thank you, I said as she helped me carry my suitcase to the front door. For everything. For the rides, for watching the house, for being the kind of friend who makes independence possible rather than threatening it. She hugged me briefly, warmly. Welcome home, Margaret. I'm glad you went, and I'm glad you're back. Inside, the house felt exactly as I'd left it, secure, peaceful, and entirely mine. The letter I'd written to David was gone from the kitchen table, which meant he'd been here, had read my words, and had perhaps begun the process of understanding what I'd been trying to tell him. I unpacked slowly, putting away clothes that smelled of Vermont air and mountain mornings, placing books on shelves where they would wait to be reread and remembered. The small treasures I'd collected during the week, a pressed leaf from a maple tree, a smooth stone from a mountain stream, a postcard of the covered bridge I'd walked across every morning, found places among my belongings like evidence of a life fully lived. The answering machine blinked with messages, but I ignored it for now. There would be time later for returning calls, for re-engaging with the practical details of daily life. For now, I wanted to simply be present in my own space, to feel the satisfaction of returning home as the same person who had left but with a deeper understanding of who that person was. I made tea with deliberate ceremony, using the good china and taking time to appreciate the familiar ritual. The Earl Grey tasted exactly as it should, comforting, grounding, and perfectly suited to my preferences. Through the kitchen window, I could see Eleanor in her garden, deadheading the last of the season's marigolds with the same patient attention she'd shown all year. The phone rang as I was finishing my tea, and David's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it ring twice before answering, not from avoidance but from the simple recognition that I could choose my own timing for difficult conversations. Hi, David. Mom. His voice carried something different, not the usual edge of impatience or barely controlled frustration, but something softer, more uncertain. I got your letter. I hoped you would. I've been thinking about what you wrote. About how I've been treating you. I didn't realize. He paused, and I could hear him struggling with words that didn't come easily. I didn't realize I was being controlling. I thought I was being helpful. The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and important. I waited, giving him space to continue, understanding that this conversation would set the tone for whatever relationship we built going forward. I talked to Sarah about it, he continued. About some of the things you said. She helped me see that maybe I've been treating you like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be respected. That wasn't your intention, I said gently. I know that. But intention and impact aren't always the same thing. No, they're not. Another pause, longer this time. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for making you feel like you couldn't make your own decisions, like your opinions didn't matter. I'm sorry for treating your independence like a threat instead of something to celebrate. The words settled into the space between us like seeds finding fertile ground. Not a complete transformation, that would take time and consistent action, but a beginning, an acknowledgement that change was possible. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. I'd like to try again. To have a different kind of relationship. One where I trust you to know what's best for yourself. I'd like that too. We talked for another few minutes, carefully but warmly, like people learning a new language together. When we hung up, I felt something had shifted, not back to the way things were, but forward to something that had never existed before. A relationship between two adults who respected each other's autonomy, who could love without controlling, and who could care without managing. The evening settled around me with familiar comfort as I moved through my house, checking locks and adjusting thermostats and performing the small rituals of security that had become second nature. But tonight each action felt different, not automatic but chosen, not compulsory but deliberate. I pulled out my notebook and turned to a fresh page, ready to add new items to my growing list of things that belonged to me. But instead, I found myself writing something different. Things I've learned to give freely: forgiveness, understanding, space for growth, and love without conditions. The words surprised me with their generosity, their recognition that reclaiming my own autonomy didn't require withholding grace from others. David's apology had been genuine, his willingness to change real. The relationship we built going forward would be different from the one we'd had, but it could be better, rooted in respect rather than habit, in choice rather than obligation. 3 weeks later, I found myself at another airport gate, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. I was traveling alone to Scotland, a trip I'd planned and booked myself, using my own resources and following my own timeline. The guidebooks in my carry-on bag were marked with places I wanted to see, experiences I wanted to have, and moments I wanted to savor at my own pace. Flight 892 to Edinburgh, we're now boarding all passengers, the gate agent announced. I gathered my things and joined the line, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The boarding pass in my hand bore my name, Margaret Chen, and my chosen seat, my selected meal preference, and my own decisions about how to spend the next 10 days. As I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent, she smiled with professional warmth. Have a wonderful trip, Mrs. Chen. Thank you, I said, and meant it. The airplane cabin was filled with the usual mix of travelers, business people checking phones, families organizing children, and couples discussing itineraries. I found my seat and settled in with the satisfaction of someone who had earned her place through her own choices rather than someone else's arrangements. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom as we prepared for takeoff. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 892 to Edinburgh. We'd like to extend a special welcome to all our passengers traveling to Scotland for the first time. I smiled, remembering another flight, another announcement, another moment when my name had been spoken with respect rather than impatience. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't surprised by the recognition. This time, I expected to be treated as a person worthy of welcome, worthy of respect, and worthy of taking up space in the world. As the plane lifted off, carrying me toward the Scottish Highlands I'd dreamed of seeing for decades, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Not just the physical journey from my house to this airplane seat, but the longer journey from accommodation to autonomy, from apologizing for my existence to celebrating it. The marigold I'd pressed between the pages of my travel journal caught the light from the airplane window, its bright color undimmed by time or distance. Eleanor had given it to me before I left, a small token of friendship and a reminder that beautiful things could bloom anywhere if given the right conditions. This time, when my name was called, it was mine to answer, I thought, watching the landscape grow smaller below us. Not because someone else had decided I deserved recognition, but because I had finally learned to recognize myself. The plane climbed toward cruising altitude, carrying me toward adventures I'd chosen, experiences I'd planned, and moments I would savor at my own pace. Behind me, my house sat secure behind locks I'd chosen, my garden waited for spring planting I would design myself, and my life continued to unfold according to my own timeline and preferences. I was Margaret Chen, traveler, reader, friend, and woman of independent means and autonomous choices. I was someone's mother, but I was also entirely myself. And for the first time in years, those two identities felt not like competing obligations but like complementary truths, each one enhancing rather than diminishing the other. The airplane settled into its steady rhythm, carrying me toward Scotland and toward whatever version of myself was waiting to be discovered there. Outside the window, the world spread out in all directions, full of possibilities I was finally ready to explore. I opened my book, a novel about a woman who'd inherited a castle in the Highlands and decided to restore it herself, and began to read. The story was just beginning, and so was mine.